So this week, we're going to start a new series called Epic Fail, where we're going to be taking some time and looking at the life of Samson. And what we're going to do is just have this conversation about how by looking at his life and the choices that he makes, that we can learn something from that, and how we can actually step into the life that God created us to live. And so what we're going to be doing is taking some time and looking at Samson. And Samson's just one of those guys, right? He's one of those guys who seems to have it all made. Do you know what I mean? He's somebody who just has all the talent in the world. For those of you who maybe aren't familiar with the story of Samson, he's somebody who's known for having this superhuman strength. And so we look at Samson and we say, man, he's got it made. This is somebody who has all the talent, all the gift, all the opportunity, all the influence in the world. And if anybody is ever going to make it, if anybody is ever going to succeed, it would be somebody like him. Because you ever notice how we look at people with those talents and those gifts and that opportunity, and we say, man, if I just had their gifts, I'd have it made. Like, they just seem to have it all. And yet what we're going to see as we look at the life of Samson is that on the surface, he seems to have it made. But when you look at his life, he just makes all the wrong choices. He fails. And he doesn't just fail, does he? It's an epic fail. And in fact, he fails so bad, so epically, we look at this story and say, it's got to be fake. Like, there's no way somebody's really that dumb. There's no way that somebody would really make those choices. And yet what we're going to see as we go through this series is not only is this story true and deeply, deeply rooted in the Jewish culture, but what we're going to see is that you and I, that we all run the risk of making the exact same mistakes. And so what we're going to do over the next several weeks is just have a conversation about how we can learn from the mistakes of Samson. And so if you've got a Bible, do me a favor. We're going to be in Judges chapter 13. Why don't you go ahead and turn there, Judges 13. If you're maybe not familiar with the Bible, it's really easy to find. It's the seventh book of the Bible, seventh book. And so if you start at the beginning and just start turning, you'll get there pretty quick. You've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges. If you don't have your Bibles, we should have Bibles in the chairs in front of you. And I think and I hope we're on page 213. And while you're turning there, I got the thumbs up, so I think I'm good. While you're turning there, just a quick little overview of the conversation today. We're going to be looking at a big picture, bird's eye view of the life of Samson. That really we're going to do a big overview of his story, but what we're going to do is zero in on a couple of things that are absolutely key to understanding what's happening throughout this story. And what we're going to see is that it's absolutely essential so that we can understand not only how to recognize the voice of God in our life, but how we're to respond to it. And so hopefully you're there by now. If you've got your Bibles, we're going to begin in Judges chapter 13, beginning in verse 2. And Samson, again, he's somebody who's known for this superhuman strength. And like any good superhero, he has an origin story. And so in Judges 13:2, we see that. It says this: there was a certain man of Zorah, of the tribe of the Danites. So just kind of hold on to that. Make a note of that Samson comes from the tribe of Dan. It's always good as we go through these stories in the Old Testament to just kind of make a mental note of the tribes. It says his name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. Now, if you've been with us before, you know this, that in the ancient world, being barren was a very, very, very big deal. The two most important things that you could have were your land and your family. And to not have one of those threatened your very survival as a family. And so this is a big, big deal that his wife is barren. They can't have kids. Verse 3, an angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, behold, you are barren and have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Therefore be careful and drink no wine or strong drink and eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. Then it says this, no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines. Now, right away, we see that Samson is different from everybody else. We see that he's a Nazirite from birth. And understand that biblically, this is very, very rare. Throughout the whole Bible, only 2 people are born under the Nazirite vow. There's one third one that's kind of debated, but we don't know for sure. But we know for sure that Samson and Samuel, a little later on, are Nazirites from birth. There's a little debate about John the Baptist, but there's not enough info to say yes or no. That Samson is somebody who's born under the Nazirite vow. Now, I wish we had time, and if I was really smart, I would have planned an entire conversation around the Nazirite vow because there's so much going on here. But in Numbers chapter 6, we see a picture of this, and I'm just going to kind of give you a nutshell version, if that's cool, of the Nazirite vow and what all that means and what that entails. And what you need to understand is that somebody under the Nazirite vow was meant to be somebody who was set apart from God. That means they're different from everybody else. And with that, we see that there are 3 main restrictions for somebody who is under the Nazirite vow. The first one is that they're not allowed to eat or drink anything from the vineyard. That means no grapes, no grape juice, no wine, not even the seeds and the skin. Are you with me? Like absolutely nothing from the vineyard. And as I think about this, I don't know about you, but I look at that and say, okay, if we're talking about a restriction to be set apart, that's pretty easy, isn't it? I feel like I could do that okay, because I don't eat a lot of grapes. Like, it's just not high on my priority list. I don't really drink a lot of wine. I don't drink grape juice. I don't go out of my way to eat seeds. I think the most grape I have is like grape jelly on a PBJ. Are you with me? Like, there we go. Like, I don't eat a lot of grape. And so as I look at this, I think to myself, this would be pretty easy. I think I could pull this off. But check this out. In the ancient world, understand that anything from the vineyard was actually a large portion of their sugar intake. Because think about it. This is a world before high fructose corn syrup, right? And so you had grapes, and that was really the good stuff. And then you had other fruit as well. And so when you think about this part of the vow, understand that this is talking about a partial sugar fast. And that's something that sounds good at first, but it gets old really quick. How many of you have ever tried to cut sugar from your life or from your coffee? How long did that last? Not long for some of us. You ever notice if you drink water for long enough, how many of you have ever said, I'm going to drink nothing but water? Like I'm cutting soda, I'm cutting juice, I'm cutting everything. I'm going to be all about the water. After about a few days, you start craving something with flavor, right? I mean, you just want something, you want anything. And so it sounds easy at first, but understand that we're talking about a partial sugar fast here. It would have been a pretty big sacrifice. The second restriction that we see is that he's not allowed to cut his hair, right? This is kind of what Samson is known for. No razor shall touch his head. And the reason that this is part of the restriction is because it's meant to be an outward sign of your vow. That people were meant to look at you and say, okay, this person is clearly under the Nazirite vow. Look at their hair. And again, we look at that and say, okay, I could probably pull that off, except for the annoying in the middle stage. But I think I could probably maybe do that. But understand that there's kind of this other nuance for Samson, because as we go through the story, especially in Judges 16, one of the things that we see is that Samson's strength is directly connected to the length of his hair, isn't it? That when his hair is long, he's strong. When it's short, he's weak. When it grows back out, he's strong again. That for some reason, God has connected his strength with the length of his hair. And don't miss this. This is going to be huge. This gift is something that God has given Samson. It is a responsibility, just like the gifts that we have. For example, maybe you're here today and you're a writer. You are the one who's responsible for what you write, aren't you? You're responsible for whether or not to use your gift of writing. Some of you are here today and you've got incredible gifts that you're not using because you don't feel like you're good enough for whatever reason. And by the way, if you have a gift and you're not using it, the only way you get better is to use it. So go use your gifts. But you're ultimately the one who's responsible for using your gift. You, for better or worse, are responsible for what you do with your gift. whether you write something good and helpful or something critical and destructive. And the same thing is true with Samson. He's responsible for keeping his hair long, and as long as it's long hair, then he is the one who's responsible for what he does with his strength. Now, the third restriction, this is where things get really, really sticky for Sammy, is he's not allowed to touch the dead. And again, in our world, we look at that and we're like, that's easy. Unless you're here today and you work in a funeral home, right? We're not really around dead people a whole lot, are we? I hope not. Like, that's just not part of our world. And so again, I think we want to look at this and say, well, that's easy, but check this out. Numbers doesn't clarify or quantify humans only. That when it talks about you're not allowed to be around the dead, it's talking about people, it's talking about animals, which means somebody under the vow would have been a vegetarian, at which point most of us said, that's it, I'm out, because I love my steak. Samson wasn't allowed to touch anything dead at all. But check this out. It goes a step further because it doesn't just specify in the Hebrew touching. The idea, the implication is you're not allowed to be around the dead, which implies killing. Samson has a restriction from taking life that God has placed on him. Isn't that interesting? And so we see that there are three major restrictions. And as we go through this story, we are meant to mentally remind ourselves every single time Samson finds himself around one of these things. Oh, wait, he's not supposed to do this. He's not supposed to do that. He's not supposed to do that. And the problem is as we go on, we see that Samson has this hesitancy, this resistance to do what God wanted him to do. Check out Judges 13:25. Says this, and the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him in Mahadan between Zorah and Eshtaol. If you've got a pen, mark, highlight, underline, circle the word stir, because this word stir is completely fascinating. In the Hebrew, this word stir is the word pa'am. Say that with me, pa'am. Oh, guys, are you awake? Are you with me? Say it with me, pa'am. That was better. Okay, pa'am is a really fascinating word. And what's so fascinating about it is it's very rarely used in the Bible. It's only used about 5 times in the Old Testament. Now, understand that in Hebrew, when a word is rarely used, that is huge. Because Hebrew is a language that really, ancient Hebrew, it doesn't have a whole lot of words. It's what scholars would call a poor man's language. There's only about 8,000 words in Hebrew. By comparison, English has about 400,000 words because, you can't get away without making YOLO a word. It's only got about 8,000 words, which means there's an economy there, right? And if a word or a phrase is infrequently used, what that should say to us as the readers is, whoa. Like, this is important. This is key to understanding the story. And pa'am, okay, our English translates it into to stir. But it literally means to disturb or to disrupt, to thrust, or to push against. Understand the implication here is that the Spirit of the Lord is calling Samson to do something he doesn't want to do. That he is pushing back against what God is asking of him. And we see this as we go through the story. Because as we go into Judges 14, we see that I don't want to say he falls in love because of the way that he treats her, but he sees this woman of the Philistines from the town of Timnah. And he wants to marry her. And in between the marriage, the engagement and the wedding, we see this weird, interesting little story. It's almost just thrown in there, and it's easy to miss it if it wasn't so cool and awesome. Notice what it says in Judges 14, verse 15, because we see the stirring, this pushback right away. It says this, then Samson went down with his father and mother to Timnah. I want to stop there really quick. In the Hebrew, the words are meant to be picturesque. The words are meant to create a word picture that creates a feeling inside of us. This word Timnah literally means forbidden. How many of you have ever watched a scary movie and you see somebody who's maybe walking down the dark hallway and it's dark and there's that music that's playing in the background, that sort of creepy ambience, and you're kind of on the edge of your seat and you're waiting for something bad to happen? That's the feeling that we're supposed to get. And so when you read Timnah, I want you to think of that soundtrack. When you read it, I want you to kind of hear the music in your head. They're going to a forbidden place, and look what happens. It says, then they came to the vineyards of Timnah. Again, one of the restrictions of the Nazirite is what? You're not supposed to eat or drink anything from the vineyard. So literally the picture here, he's going to a forbidden place to eat a forbidden fruit, and that's when something interesting happens. Check this out. And behold, a young lion came towards him roaring. How many of you, if you were to close your eyes and picture this scene, you picture Samson walking, minding his own business, when all of a sudden out of the bushes comes this giant ferocious lion. Like the mane is flowing, he is bearing down on Samson, and Samson is in danger for his life. Isn't this usually how we read this story? That Samson's life is on the line. But I want you to read it again. What's the word in front of lion? What kind of lion is it? It's a young. It's a young lion. Now, the picture of this word young, it's not talking about like a baby lion. It's talking about a young lion cub. Think about Simba, right? We've seen The Lion King. The moment when Simba meets Timon and Pumbaa, Hakuna Matata. Are you with me? Good. That's the picture here. It's this young lion. And it's roaring. You can check this out on YouTube. There's awesome videos of little lion cubs that are trying to learn their roar. And they come out and they're roaring, and it sounds like a squeak toy. It's like the sweetest thing ever. Of course, any baby animal video is like the cutest thing ever, isn't it? I saw a baby octopus the other day. I'm like, that's the cutest thing ever. It's an octopus. They're gross. Not that one. It was cute. And so understand, the picture here isn't of this big, fully grown lion that is going to kill Samson. The picture is of a harmless little lion cub that comes out of the bushes and is no threat at all. And that's what makes this next verse so problematic. Look at what it says. Then the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him, and although he had nothing in his hands, he tore the lion into pieces as one tears a young goat. But he did not tell his father and his mother. Now, I don't know about you, but as I read that story, it seems to me like the Spirit of God is actually enabling Samson to tear this lion to pieces. That the Spirit of the Lord, it's almost like it's encouraging him, doesn't it? Because as I read it, that's what it looks like and that's what it seems. But there's a problem with that, isn't there? What's the problem? Remember, God's vow, or Samson's vow to God, was that he was not allowed to kill. Which raises the question, why would the Spirit of the Lord actually almost enable or make Samson do something that breaks his vow? That doesn't make sense, does it? That's what we would call a paradox. And so the question that we're meant to ask is, what is going on here? Is God actually encouraging his person to break his own vow to God? Or is there something else, something deeper going on? And to help us, I want us to remember that Samson is the one who's responsible for what he does with his strength, right? Just like with our talents and our gifts, we are responsible for what we do. The same is true with Samson. That Samson, for whatever reason, and I really wish we had time to go into that one, but maybe I'll do a Facebook video later. For whatever reason, Samson tears this lion apart of his own accord, which raises the question, doesn't it? What's the Spirit of the Lord doing here? Now, what's interesting is this phrase, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, is a phrase that's only used 8 times in the Old Testament. 8 times. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him. 8 times. Of those 8 times, 3 of those times are in this story. Now again, if a word or a phrase is rarely used, and we see it used, it's meant to draw attention. It's important. If we see it 3 times in the same story, that means it's absolutely essential to understanding what's happening here. And so the question we have to ask is, what does this phrase mean when the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson? Now again, 8 times. Only 1 time do we see the Spirit of the Lord being defined in the Bible. Check out what it says in Isaiah 11, verse 2. You can look it up. You can write it down and fact check me later. I won't be offended, I promise. Isaiah 11, verse 2. And the Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him. A spirit of wisdom, of understanding, spirit of counsel and of might, spirit of knowledge and fear or respect of the Lord. Now, I know we see the word might in there, but as we look at the big picture, what is the vast majority of that? 5 of the 6 has to do with understanding what God wants of us, right? That's how I read this, spirit of wisdom and understanding and counsel, knowledge and fear of the Lord. It seems like the Spirit of God has to do with understanding what God wants from us. Now let's put that definition and put it into this story and see if the story makes more sense. On the one hand, the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Samson, and even though this lion isn't a threat to him, the Spirit empowers him or enables him to tear it apart, or the Spirit reminds him of his vow, reminds him that he's not supposed to take a life. The Spirit rushes on him, and the word rush here means a sudden, quick, overpowering sensation or presence. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon him and says, "Don't do it, Samson. Don't kill the lion." But Samson wants what Samson wants. The Spirit is stirring against him. And Samson tears the lion of his own accord. Now to me, it makes sense for the other, but I'll tell you what. Let's quickly go through the rest of the story and see if it matches. Let's see if it fits. Because we see that Samson goes and gets married. And in fact, in verse 10, it says he's at the wedding feast. And I love this. The word feast there literally means drinking bout. Again, Samson has broken his vow. And as happens, whenever you get a bunch of people who have maybe had a little too much to drink, bad decisions are made. That's just kind of a thing, isn't it? Okay, so they make a bad decision. Samson says, here's the deal, guys. He's talking to his groomsmen. He's got 30 of these groomsmen. He says, here's the deal. I'm going to make you a bet. I bet you I can come up with an unsolvable riddle. That I'm going to come up with this riddle that you can't solve. And if you can't solve it, well, you're going to owe me 30 linen cloths, which is talking about like an undergarment. It was really soft. And then 30 fine robes. But if you solve it, I'll give you those things. They say, okay, sounds good. So he tells them this riddle. And they cannot figure it out at all. I mean, they are stumped. Time goes by. They're coming up on the deadline. They're feeling the pressure. This is going to cost them some serious money. And so finally, in their desperateness, the groomsmen, all of which are Philistine, by the way, go to Samson's new wife and says, here's the deal. You're going to tell us the answer to the riddle, or we're going to burn you and your family to death. Not the nicest group of people. So she goes to Samson, gets the answer. She tells them, they tell Samson. And as you can imagine, Samson's a little angry. And in fact, he actually calls his wife a heifer. Now, guys, never do that. Just kind of a good rule of thumb. Never call your wife a heifer. It never ends well. I'm telling you. Samson gets angry. He calls his wife a heifer. And now he's got to pay the debt. And so this is a problem for Samson because we don't really have any clues that he has a whole lot of money. So notice what happens next. The very next thing. He calls her a heifer. Verse 19 says this. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him. And he went down to Ashkelon and struck down 30 men of the town, took their spoil and gave the garments to those who he had told the riddle. And in his hot anger, he went back to his father's house. Now, I think what we want to do is look at this and say, yeah, he killed 30 guys, but they were Philistines. And the Philistines are the bad guys. And so clearly it's okay that he killed a bunch of Philistines. But check this out. Ashkelon was 25 miles away from where the wedding was. This isn't an army that he's going up against. He goes into a random town and murders 30 random people in order to pay his debt. Samson is not really a good guy in this moment. And again, the question we have to ask is, what is the Spirit of the Lord doing? Is the Spirit encouraging him to commit mass murder? I don't know about you, that doesn't seem to fit the character of God, does it? Or, in his anger, because we know he's angry, the Spirit comes on him and says, don't do it. Don't kill those people. Work off your debt. Do anything else, Samson, but do not break your vow. But Samson is stirring, and Samson is going to do what Samson is going to do. And so Samson goes down and he kills all those people. He goes and pays off his debt, and then he goes to his father's house, and he's there for a while. Like months and months and months goes by. And in the meantime, her father thinks that Samson has actually divorced her. In verse 2 of chapter 15, it says, I thought that you utterly hated her. That word utterly hate is divorce language in Hebrew. And so time goes by. He thinks that Samson has divorced her. He actually marries her off to somebody else. Time goes by. Samson says, you know what? I'm going to make amends. And so he actually goes back to the town with a young goat because, some guys, we bring flowers. Some people, you bring goats. Some of us maybe need to up our game to the goat level. I don't know. But he brings a goat to make amends. And the father says, look, I thought you divorced her. I thought this was over. I thought you were the ex that we'd forgotten about. We already married her off to somebody else. But here, I want to make this right. Marry her younger sister because I want to do something to make it right. But Samson doesn't care. Samson wants revenge. And in fact, he says, this time I'm innocent. This time I deserve justice. And so he comes up with this plan. He catches 300 foxes. By the way, the word fox there probably is better translated as jackals, which makes sense because jackals are pack animals, whereas foxes are very isolated animals. Either way, he gets 300 of these guys, and he ties them in pairs of 2 by their tails. And he puts a torch between his tails. And notice what happens next. Judges 15:5. It says this, and when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and set fire to the stacked grain, the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards. Now for us, how many of us read that and we're like, okay. Like it seems like he burned a whole lot of stuff. That must have been bad, I guess. When it describes the stacked grain and the standing grain, understand the standing grain is what's out in your fields. The stacked grain is what's in the barn. This is a picture of complete and total destruction. Essentially what's happening here is Samson is forcing an entire village into starvation. I want you to understand the implications of this. This isn't just kind of a fun little story about foxes. This is a very big deal. People are likely going to starve to death because of the choice that Samson made. And at this point, he goes into hiding, but the Philistines, they're a little bit angry. I know, I'm surprised too. They're angry. And so they go to the tribe of Judah, which is like the bigger brother, right? When the little brother's getting out of line, you go to the big brother and say, look, tell him to knock it off. And that's what they do. They say, here's the deal. Either you bring us Samson or we're going to war with you. Judah's like, whoa, that escalated quickly. Okay. And so they take 3,000 men. They go and they find Samson. They say, here's the deal. We need to turn you in. Samson's like, that's fine. You can turn me in, but don't kill me. You can tie me up, but just don't kill me. And that's what they do. They tie him up and they take him to the village of Lehi. And that's when we see this in Judges 15, verse 14. When they came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. I want to stop there. Based on what we know about Samson, based on the track record that we've gone through, how do you think he's going to respond to people yelling at him? I don't know. I just don't see him as a very forgiving type of guy. Do you? I think this is probably going to make him a little bit angry. Notice what happens next. It says, the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that had caught fire, and his bonds melted off of his hands. He found the fresh jawbone of a donkey. By the way, I always get people who ask me, what in the world is the deal with the jawbone? How many of you have ever wondered that? Anybody? It's this weird, random little note, but it's actually very important. So in the ancient world, whenever an animal died, they would use all of its body parts for tools and all kinds of different things. And the jawbone was used like a reaper sickle, right? You picture the Grim Reaper and that giant tool that he has? That's what they used it for. It was the blade that was tearing everything up and reaping. And so understand, it's not like this random little thing that they found. But again, he's not allowed to touch anything dead. Again, he breaks his vow, but that's nothing compared to what's about to happen. It says he put out his hand and he took it, and with it he struck down 1,000 men. Again, the question we need to ask is, what is the Spirit of the Lord doing? Is the Spirit of the Lord wanting him to break his vow to God? Or does the Spirit of the Lord trying to stop him from killing 1,000 people? And let's be honest, if we were in their shoes, we would be the ones demanding justice. If people died because of this man's actions, we would have said, we deserve justice. They have the right to be angry. And Samson, honestly, according to the Torah, he owes them something. But he's not going to do it because Samson's stirring against God. And he kills 1,000 men. And that's when something interesting happens, because nowhere else throughout the story of Samson do we see the phrase, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. And what's so interesting about that is there's lots of opportunities. We see the story of Samson and Delilah. We know this story. And as you go through that story, there are all these times when it's like if the Spirit of the Lord was going to show up on Samson, it would have been there, it would have been there, it would have been there. And it's strangely silent. And I think that's important. And the reason I think it's important is because we can live a life that is constantly ignoring God. And if we live a life that is constantly ignoring God, don't be surprised if there comes this moment when he's hard to hear. Because we're really, really good at tuning things out, aren't we? How many of you have ever tuned something out? Maybe for you, you're a parent and it's your kids. No, that doesn't happen. I remember when we lived in Virginia, we lived by the airport, but we also lived by an Air Force base. And we had like airplanes going over our house all the time. I mean, it was just constant to the point where we tuned it out. But the weird thing is we didn't even realize we tuned it out until we'd have people over from out of town. They're like, wow, is that airplanes? We're like, oh yeah. I just didn't even hear it anymore. Slowly over time, I began to lose my ability to hear the planes because I slowly began to tune it out. And if we're not careful, the same thing is true when it comes to the voice of God. If we live a life where we are constantly tuning God out, where we are constantly ignoring the voice of God, don't be surprised if there comes a moment when he's really hard to hear. And so the question we need to ask is how are we responding to God's voice? Which raises the question, how do I know I'm hearing God's voice, right? Isn't it funny how in church world, we talk about hearing the voice of God as if everybody automatically knows what it is? Like, oh yeah, that's what it is. Is it audible? Is it a feeling? Is it a sensation? How do you quantify that? Check this out. In this story, it's very, very clear what it looks like and what it feels like. The Spirit of the Lord rushes on Samson in a moment of temptation. Have you ever been in a moment of temptation when you're about to do something you know you're not supposed to do? Maybe for you, it was that feeling when you were a kid and you were about to take that cookie and you knew you weren't supposed to take the cookie, but I mean, it's chocolate chip and it's fresh, come on. We've all got limitations. And you're about to take it and there was that voice in your head. There was that sudden rush of anxiety. Do you know what I'm talking about? That voice in your head that said, don't do it. Don't take the cookie. Don't lie to your parents about taking the cookie. Don't do this, don't do that. And it was like this sudden, strong, overwhelming sensation. And you knew that you weren't supposed to do it. You knew you were about to do something wrong. That is the Spirit of God that we see in this story. The Spirit of the Lord comes to us. One of the ways is in a moment of temptation when we're about to do something that we're not supposed to do. And it rushes on us and says, don't do it. Don't do that thing that you know is going to cost you. That I know it looks good right now, but down the road, it's going to be so destructive for your life. And the question that we need to ask is, how do you respond to that voice? In that moment of temptation, when you know what the right thing to do is, do you do the right thing or the easy thing? How are you responding to the Spirit of the Lord rushing on you? Because if you live a life that's constantly ignoring it, there comes a point where you begin to become a little bit numb to that sensation. There comes a point when you stop feeling the rush. You don't hear the voice as loudly as you did before because, well, I've just put it off for so long. I almost expect it. I just knock it away. How are you responding to the voice of God in your life? Because if you live a life ignoring that voice and tuning out the voice of God, guess what? You are setting yourself up for the same epic failure that we see in the life of Samson. Let me pray. God, thank you for today. God, thank you for your grace and your mercy and your love, for the good things that you've given to us. God, thank you for your Spirit that rushes on us in a moment of temptation, in the moments when we're about to do something that we know that we're not supposed to do. God, we're thankful that you're present with us. God, I pray that you would give us ears to hear your voice, even in the most overwhelming of temptations. The things that are our things that we keep going to, those bad habits we keep going to over and over and over again. God, help us to hear your still small voice speaking inside of us saying, don't do it. And give us the courage to obey, even when every other part of our body wants to do what we know we're not supposed to do. God, help us to live a life that's obedient to you so that we can avoid the epic fails of our life. For it's in Jesus' name we pray.